Quackity quack! We are backity back with our third episode of the Duck on a Rock podcast. I'm Colin McDonough. I am joined by my co-hosts Matt Met and Matt McDonough. Today for our third episode, we have no guests, but the three of us are going to talk about the WNBA. The WNBA season started. The Connecticut Sun are tied for the worst record in the league at 1-6, tied with former UConn national champion Paige Becker's Dallas Wings. The New York Liberty, the defending WNBA champions, have remained on top. They're undefeated. So a lot of action happening on the court in the WNBA, but we're going to kind of take you off the court today for some news about the Connecticut Sun.
So, as some of you may know, the Mohegan tribe, owners of the Connecticut Sun franchise, are exploring a sale of the team that could possibly result in relocation. So, you can check out our latest blog that goes into more detail. But what I'd like to hear from the two of you today are some of the potential rebrand options and maybe walk through a few of your favorites.
Yeah, so this has been sort of on the mind since almost 2 years ago, if not a year and a half ago. There was mention of a possible Boston WNBA franchise. And now outgoing Celtics owner Wick Grusbeck did mention it as a possibility. Obviously, with the WNBA expanding, Boston would be a great basketball city, but with the Connecticut Sun, very short drive away, as well as being pretty much definitely on social media, as well as coming on to 2 seasons, borrowing the Celtics arena for a night, a sister team. So that kind of started the idea of, well, would a move to Boston from the Sun be possible, or would there be 2 teams in New England, which obviously has great women's basketball fandom and history. From there, that kind of took our minds to thinking of possible rebrands. And from the start, I've always been partial to the Boston Banshees. I think it's a great name. It's a great bar in Dorchester, and it would be a great women's sports team. You have the Irish folklore aspect of it in an Irish heavy city like Boston. And you have the sort of haunting aspect of a woman in a field, a ghastly, ghostly woman, shrill crying, wailing, screaming, and foreshadowing those who see her. It foreshadows their death. So it's pretty cool sports name in general. Great for a professional women's team. I'm surprised it hasn't really touched upon sports teams in general, or especially in Boston, and that definitely is my personal favorite, as well as the option I'd most closely push for. The Boston Charm or Charms was mentioned a year and a half ago by Wick Grusbeck as a possibility. So those were the 2 big Boston names we looked at. But us being Connecticut natives, not naggers, Connecticut Sun fans, I don't want to see the team move. I'd rather them, figure out a resolution to be in the state, despite technically them being on Native American land, owned by the Mohegan tribe, not technically on state property, but they're the Connecticut Sun. They're the Connecticut professional team. And the Mohegan tribe, the Mohegan Sun Arena, the Connecticut Sun, it's been a great thing for the state. And it would be unfortunate should they move out of the state. So then we started thinking beyond, okay, the Mohegan tribe does sell to a buyer that would keep them in Connecticut, move them to Boston. Let's think of just New England-esque names. And that's where we kind of applied Connecticut Charm to the team if they were to stay in Hartford, as well as Connecticut Pros, Connecticut Pride, teams that have history, having historical relevance, as well as sports relevance, as well as even a return to the New England Blizzard of the 90s. So those were kind of the main directions we went in when evaluating that and kind of looking at where from there.
Yeah, and I think too, like we're interested in this stuff. We like history, we like geography, we like trying to see how that would tie in. Obviously, a lot of minor league baseball teams now change their brand identity multiple times a year. So you see that often with different, geographical or historical significances for those areas. I think Connecticut Sun, obviously, most Native American team names are, depending on who you talk to, they're either going by the wayside or have been gone. Connecticut Sun, because of the relationship with the tribe, has stayed. Just an interesting kind of weather pattern to have, as Matt said, the Blizzard be a team from the 90s. And then in the same state, you have the Sun. But other than that, it's fit Connecticut, even though they haven't been able to ever get over the top and win a WNBA title, which doesn't seem like it'll happen this year unless, something crazy happens the next few months. But I think, too, the fun part about doing this together was talking about it. Like Matt said, the initial Boston expansion team named the Boston Charm, thinking about Irish lucky charms, Irish charms, for a women's basketball team, even the charm of the city of Boston. You think of brick sidewalks, old street lamps, that type of thing. And then even like Matt said, the in the article, the history of witchcraft in Massachusetts, even though it's more Salem, and as Matt alluded to, Connecticut was kind of cool to talk about.
Can you talk a little more about the history of the Blizzard?
Yeah, and so the Blizzard, it was 96 to 98, I believe, was the entire league, which the Blizzard was a charter member of. They played most of their games in Hartford, some in Springfield, both arenas, then called the Civic Center. But the Blizzard, and I recall, being very young, but knowing the team existed, they were covered locally, and they had, and looking it up today, I mean, it was almost like a ABA NBA situation,
Mm.
you know, even like comparable to some of the NFL quarterbacks who started in the USFL, where you had Rebecca Lobo drafted by them. So Pete Maravich was drafted by the Carolina Cougars, ends up starting his career with the Hawks, and then you have in the NBA, and then you have with the so you had examples of Pete Maravich being drafted by the Carolina Cougars. He chooses the NBA's Atlanta Hawks. Rebecca Lobo with the WNBA in its infancy at the time, thanks to the success of women's college basketball in the 90s, where you had Tennessee and the undefeated 95 UConn women. You had the New England Blizzard and the WNBA almost competing. So Lobo ends up going to the Liberty. Kara Walters, Jen Rosati, they end up playing for the Blizzard, but the league and team folds. And it was pretty cool to, see, and I remember Casey Jones, that's his last coaching stop. You had a Hall of Famer, Casey Jones, won championships as a player, as an assistant, and from 1986 being the head coach of the world champion Boston Celtics to 1996 coaching the New England Blizzard at the Hartford Civic Center and a women's league, trying to get a start and stability. So I think that name would be a great return for nostalgia. But I do think there is the market for Hartford to have a WNBA team. Would it necessarily be what Boston would be? I'm not quite sure. But you look at the TD Garden as a venue, highly doubt the balcony would be full on a lot of nights compared to the XL Center, which I'm sure would get the 16,000 for former UConn players coming back, for Caitlin Clark coming to Hartford. Not that Boston wouldn't get that, because the Sun are playing the Fever in Boston this year, which I'm sure will be packed. But I think Hartford is a viable option. I was talking to Disgruntled earlier today, and he made a great point about the casino being like a day trip. And I do wonder, the Sun averaging, 8 to 10,000. If people do make it a day of the casino, I'm sure, basketball with the amenities and entertainment right there is appealing. But Hartford would be more just focused on the basketball and bring more events to the city.
Well, it definitely does make sense when you think about a professional sports team in Connecticut. Women's basketball just makes sense. There is a demonstrated fan base, a fan base that has been around for decades now. So thinking about, a professional sports team in Connecticut, the WNBA, it does just seem to make sense. When thinking back, so going back to the Blizzard, so was Rebecca Lobo drafted by both the WNBA as well as the ABL and made the decision to go to the WNBA? Were they both in their early stages at the time? How exactly did that go down?
So the WNBA was 90. It was founded in 96. So they started play during what I believe was the second season or the third season of the other women's league, where you had two competing leagues, two upstarts. But the WNBA had the advantage of being in the NBA markets, having, I know they say the brother sister dynamic, but it was more, the NBA was more of a parent club, obviously not like minor leagues going into call ups for baseball, but it was that relationship where you had teams in only NBA markets, playing, sharing arenas and venues. Where you look at the WNBA today, you have more independent ownership groups. You have teams kind of finding what works for them within an NBA market or city. Like the New York Liberty, had bounced around. They were at MSG, they were playing up in Westchester, obviously finding a home in Brooklyn now and announcing a big practice facility for them there. So, the Orlando Miracle moved to Connecticut. They went away from the NBA, puppet strings, and kind of created their own path. And that would be, going back to all of this, the whole point of the article was for fun. You want to be able to get creative, despite the AI not working as well as I would have liked. The imagery and color schemes never really matched, and sometimes the words wouldn't always match what I wanted it to do, but at least it gets you thinking, right? Like, there's not many usable logos in terms of how every logo is now streamlined to be on a golf shirt or easily printed on a hat. But at least the names, sort of the direction you could go with imagery is there. I'm not going to pretend that I'm some Connecticut Sun season ticket holder. I like to watch them on NBC Sports Boston or nationally when they're on, or now Ion. But, it would be a sad day for a lot of, people in the state if they were to leave the state altogether, if they were to, have a change venue. And, it's, even if they were to go to Boston, yeah, it's close, but it wouldn't be Connecticut's team anymore. And as Cole said, and I think with the way they do the NBA now, with the Sun have two conference titles, but they have like two other runner-ups, where they're, them and the New England Revolution and Buffalo Bills are in, not so elite company, where they've made at least four finals in a sport, as well as the Minnesota Vikings. I'm sure some more will come to mind, but they've made 4 to 5 finals in a sport and never won one. So that's the other thing where it would be cool to see Connecticut get a professional championship, and that wouldn't happen should they move. But at the end of the day, looking at this in sort of a fun, creative way, that was kind of the whole point. And I think like there is, as you were saying, I think with the amount of former UConn players across the league, I mean, like even the role players that have stuck in the league for 1 to 5 years over the years, to players who you may have forgotten about that are still making their careers last. You have Tiffany Hayes in Golden State now. After a long career in Atlanta, she bounced around. I think she was in Las Vegas last year. She's sticking. Tina Charles, obviously famously left the Sun, and then has since bounced around as well after the Liberty, kind of become a vagabond of sorts. She's back with the Sun, and then like so
Bria Hartley.
yeah, Rhea Hartley, and then you have sort of the tail end of the Stewart dynasty into the what would be called lean years of no national championships, many Final Four berths. You have a lot of those players making a name for themselves in the WNBA, and that is one selling point for the team to stay in Connecticut, because Paige Beckers was in Connecticut this past week, playing. Like you have Kia Nurse in the Sky. Like you have these players who are just doing great in the league. That's very competitive to stay in. You have second round picks getting cut. There's not the G League that the NBA has. The NBA. You unfortunately had guys like Alex Oriaki, Denham Brown, Stanley Robinson, those types of guys who were drafted second round that didn't get to have a place to develop. And that's the same thing with the WNBA now. If you don't make it out of camp, you're kind of, and UConn players stay, and there are a lot of them all across the league. And I wonder if, it wasn't out in Uncasville, if it was more centrally located, would people show up more? I don't know, but that would be definitely appealing. I'm not sure that the WNBA, they're looking, obviously Golden State, they have Toronto and Cleveland on the horizon. I'm sure Philadelphia, if they're smart, would be an expansion city. And, that franchise should try to pry Don Staley from South Carolina, but the league's not going to expand to, Columbia, South Carolina, or Waco, Texas, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, or Iowa City. They're going to, try to go into bigger markets and stick with NBA markets, maybe return to Houston. But I think Connecticut's one exception. I really think, what the Connecticut Sun was able to do should be rewarded and hopefully maintained.
And even, Governor Ned Lamont had said Hartford as an option. And you brought up the Liberty, building a practice facility. That may be one of the big selling points, right? Because you think about if the Sun were to move to Boston, they could possibly use the Arbeck Center. The Boston Pride women's hockey team uses the Bruins Warrior Ice Arena for practices and games, I think. So if the WNBA did move to Boston, they have a possible practice facility for use if they chose to share it, with the Boston Landing area up there with the Celtics and Bruins. They're not Celtics aren't practicing at Hellenic College in Brookline anymore. So when you think about this stuff, even the NBA, as far as the practice facilities, that's been a last decade or two type of thing, where if some WNBA teams start, like you said, some go it alone, some don't. And even, getting back to logos and team names, the partnerships with the NBA kind of created at the start of the WNBA some great names. The most successful, shortest dynasty of the league history was the first 4 years, the Houston Comets. That aligns with Rockets. Charlotte's Sting aligned with the Hornets, right? So, even New York Liberty didn't align directly with the Knicks, but that's as good a team name as you could get. The WNBA has some great names, right? Like even getting back to, like we said, history and geography, Chicago Sky, birthplace of, the skyscraper, Atlanta Dream, honoring the birthplace of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So you kind of have a situation where you have those options, and then you could also do things like Golden State. I don't know what percentage of the population of the Bay Area is Nordic, but the Valkyries, the Norse, Viking woman warrior, is kind of similar to your suggestion of Boston Banshees, which would be kind of good in team names, like almost like thinking of the Vikings or the Pirates or the Raiders or the Buccaneers, that type of thing.
And even as was suggested, because one team that is a kind of a good example to that, I sometimes forget, and obviously with the Thunder in the finals, the Seattle Storm with the Supersonics leaving, and they've been able to kind of keep basketball alive. They've been very successful, even despite Breanna Stewart leaving, their free agency, Sue Bird retiring. They did have a championship run there. And then with, them redoing what was Key Arena, for the Seattle Kraken, like they are, and, Seattle is a huge MLS city too, before the MLS truly started really exploding with the MLS growth. If you look at it the last 10 years, even there's a team in San Diego the last couple of years, you forget how much they've expanded, and it looks like the WNBA is on that trajectory. But as you said, Call, like they're gonna probably return to some of the cities that didn't work out. Even Portland, I think, is mentioned or in play, if not solidified. And they did try to kind of, you had the Detroit Shock move to Tulsa. So you did have teams kind of make moves to see if they could carve out that niche in certain areas that didn't have, a professional team, or, like Hartford, in Tulsa, they have, double A minor league baseball teams. So that there is an argument to keep it in Connecticut. I don't think if a team were to move to, if the Sun were bought by a Tennessee group, I don't think they'd be, going to Knoxville. I'm sure Nashville, or a partnership with the Memphis Grizzlies would be it. But like, I think, trying to keep the Sun in Connecticut would be good for the league, and their best interests. But as you did say, in terms of the Valkyries, I do think the Sirens, that was one of the team identities we looked at, incorporating, a mermaid type figure with New England's nautical, elements would be a pretty cool look. Not saying that it makes sense to move to, Providence or, whatever armory they have down in Newport. Like you want to stay either in Connecticut or Boston. You're not, I think in the Portland Convention Center where the main Celtics play. None of those are options, so I really think New England is two markets here, if you include Connecticut as one, and obviously Boston as the other. But the Sirens, it's San Francisco not going for it with the Storm keeping their original brand. It'd be a cool sort of thing to consider. But we'll see. The one thing, if you look at kind of how the transactions of teams have taken place in the four major sports, all the expansion hockey teams, with the Vegas Golden Knights and Seattle Kraken, maybe it's just how time is moving in our lives, getting older, but it seems like expansion teams might take a little longer, but still seem to be quick, and moving a team is a lot easier than an expansion team. So, one of those markets in the WNBA who are trying to get an expansion team that they'll have to wait 2 years might see this opportunity, and offer a pretty good chunk of change to move the Sun, whether it's down the coast or across the country, and say, hey, we don't have to wait the 2 years. We could have the team play here next year now. And similar with the Arizona Coyotes, it was the arena was not going well, and then hey, you'll go to Utah next year and start playing, and then figure it out, and that could be another possibility. And the places where they'd be able to start playing and figuring it out would be an NBA market where there's already an arena there. And if not, maybe a smaller, a lot of the NBA markets now have smaller G League arenas there too. So you have practice facilities, you have arenas of different capacities, as well as a big arena if needed. So it'll be interesting to see, and we'll follow it closely. And should they move to Boston again? Really pushing for the Banshees. I'm not sure how much stuff I'd buy if they're not the Banshees, but I will say I will definitely buy some stuff if they are the Banshees, and maybe I'll get a check in the mail for a percentage of that as a kickback.
All right. So to wrap things up here, can you briefly explain the inspiration behind the Connecticut Pros?
So that's another name that I've kind of been failing to catch on. It was definitely a submission of someone on this podcast for the name when they were trying to name the Hartford Yard Goats. That was definitely a submission that unfortunately was overlooked. But I do think it's a decent, somewhat cheesy, but also a pretty decent way to honor Connecticut's history. I think we have a lot of strong writers from here, past and present, especially working education. It's funny the amount of authors or writers you read or teach and see have Connecticut ties one way or another. Historically speaking, a lot of writers who were born here or died here or spent some time here. And I think the Connecticut Pros, I think it'd be, if anyone with Yard Goat connections are listening, I think it'd be a great
PROSC. PROSC.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, you could read it in the article. It's PROSC. Make sure you click on
At
the article.
duckonarocksports.com.
Yeah, click on the article, as many devices as possible. But that, it is a little pun there and play on words with, being a professional team, and then having a history of writing within the state. So originally I wanted it, kind of a zany Mark Twain mascot for instead of the Yard Goats, and then you could kind of make, could have other Connecticut-based authors in a race. You could kind of figure out a funny mascot within that name, but maybe a paperclip or something. But the point is, I do think it would not be a terrible basketball name either. So that was more of a personal suggestion, whereas the Pride being, having CBA history. And then the Blizzard, as we already talked about, was rooted on the basketball court in the Hartford area. And those were two names, the Pride being able to incorporate the Lioness, the mother lion, who's often, the leader in charge of the group of the Pride of Lions. So I think that would be a very strong imagery that you could incorporate with the Connecticut Pride logo. And then the Pros, you could kind of get a little more creative with it. And if not, I think the Yard Goats definitely should consider it. Again, similar to the Sun, I'm not some Yard Goat season ticket holder, but I think I've seen them play as the Steamed Cheeseburgers just as much as I've seen them play as the Hartford Yard Goats. So half the time, similar to a Thursday night NBA game, you don't know who's wearing what or what team is which when you walk into Duncan Park some nights. But it sells. So, as I said in the article, money talks.
So with that, thank you everyone for listening. We have a poll that we've posted in our article. So please feel free to vote on your favorite choice. Additionally, we'd love to hear from all of you. So if you have additional suggestions or thoughts on the rebrand, please feel free to leave a comment either on this podcast or any of our socials. But to close this out, again, please feel free to follow us, Duck on a Rock Sports, on social media. Follow the blog, duckonarocksports.com. And we thank you for being part of our flock.